Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 100th episode of the Catholics Against Militarism podcast. I've been wondering what to do with this momentous occasion, and I've had various ideas, but I've settled on the fact that I should, for this episode, share with you the beef I now have with E. Michael Jones, one of my favorite guests. Just kidding. That's totally just to try to keep you intrigued. I don't think I have any beef with E. Michael Jones. I did recently submit an essay to Culture Wars magazine, and he rejected it. I didn't want to be published in his magazine anyway. It's fine. No, but seriously, I did spend a long time writing an essay for Culture Wars, and he did not care to publish it. And so I thought to myself, you know what? I should just read it on the podcast. Most of you, a lot of you, have come from my interviews with E. Michael Jones, and so you're aware of his ideas and his scholarship, and a lot of you have told me that you came here for E. Michael Jones, but you stuck around because you discovered Father McCarthy. And so I thought for this, given that these two men have played such a big role on the CAM podcast, and I've been giving so much thought to these issues for such a long time, I wanted to talk about what I've witnessed as a teacher, as a podcast host over the last decade with both of these men and their work in mind. E. Michael Jones, like I said, did not care to publish this in his magazine. No hard feelings, I guess. But I'm going to read it to you here because it was meant to be an open letter. It was meant to be a letter to him to start a dialogue. But it was also meant to be just a letter to anybody who's familiar with his work, in hopes of starting a conversation and getting a dialogue going. And it became apparent he didn't really want to have that dialogue, and that's totally fine. But I'm gonna read what I wrote here, and so I'm calling this an open letter to him, although he's already read it. But it's also an open letter to anybody who's kind of familiar with his work. And so I'll read it. It's called Catholics at War and the Heart of Tragedy. And it's really long. So, put your feet up, get a cup of tea, and I hope you'll stick with me for the long haul here. As early as 1891, Pope Leo XIII, in his encyclical, oh, dang, I should have looked up the pronunciation of these words before I started. I'm not going to do that. I don't have time for that. Rerum Novarum? I'll start over. As early as 1891, Pope Leo XIII, in his encyclical Rerum Novarum, asserted the need for a new international order in which peace would be based on justice rather than military defense. At the outbreak of World War I, Pope Benedict XVI immediately declared the neutrality of the Holy See, condemning the war for its futility and calling it a, quote, useless massacre and, quote, the suicide of civilized Europe, unquote. In his encyclical Ad Beatissimum, he outlined the causes of wars and methods of attaining peace. He devised and offered peace plans to both sides based on reconciliation and forgiveness, not revenge. His peace plans were dismissed in favor of another approach at Versailles, to which he was not invited. Pope Pius XII declared in his Christmas message of 1944 that there is a duty besides imposed on all, a duty which brooks no delay, no procrastination, no hesitation, no subterfuge. It is the duty to do everything to ban once and for all wars of aggression as legitimate solution of international disputes and as means towards realizing national aspirations. He said it was our supreme obligation to make war on war. In 1963, Pope John XXIII wrote in Pacem in Terris that in an age such as ours that prides itself on its atomic energy and its in an age such as ours that prides itself on its atomic energy, it is contrary to reason to hold that war is now a suitable way to restore rights which have been violated. In Gaudium et Spes, 1965, Pope Paul VI wrote, "We should fervently ask God to give these men the strength to go forward perseveringly and to follow through courageously on this work of building peace with vigor. It is a work of supreme love for mankind. Today it certainly demands that they extend their thoughts and their spirit beyond the confines of their own nation, that they put aside national selfishness and ambition to dominate other nations, and that they nourish a profound reverence for the whole of humanity, which is already making its way so laboriously toward greater unity." As the first pope to visit and address the United Nations in 1965, Pope Paul VI said, "No more war. War never again." In the message of Pope Paul VI on the inaugural World Day of Peace on January 1st, 1968, he said, "We extend the invitation, that of dedicating to thoughts and resolutions of peace, a special observance on the first day of the civil year, for the meditation upon and the fostering of the great and yearned for gift of peace, of which the world has so much need." In 1983, the U.S. bishops wrote in the Challenge of Peace that offensive war of any kind is not morally justifiable. In the speech he gave upon his departure from Sarajevo in 1997, Pope John Paul II said, "Allow me to repeat the words, never again war." In 2003, John Paul II said in his message to American military chaplains, "By now it should be clear to all that the use of war as a means of resolving disputes between states was rejected, even before the UN Charter, by the consciences of the majority of humanity, except in the case of legitimate defense against an aggressor." That same year, the United States invaded a country that had not attacked it. The military that carried out the invasion of Iraq was at least 50% Christian and 25% Catholic. Pope Benedict XVI said, "There is no allowance for preemptive war in the Catechism." Yet, the invasion was followed by a decades-long occupation which killed hundreds of thousands of people and decimated the Christian population, all with the help of a military that was at least 50% Christian, 25% Catholic. How many Catholics planned the war, I don't know, but we can assume similar percentages. Does anyone else see a problem here? Is the problem the Jews? 5 years ago, I invited E. Michael Jones onto my podcast, Catholics Against Militarism, to find out more about his anti-war views. I asked him, why did we go to war in Iraq? Israel, he said. It's all about Israel. I love E. Michael Jones, most of all for his candor. His answer was simple and clear, and it made sense. I know Dr. Jones better now than I did then, and I would like to pick up the conversation where we left off on that podcast 5 years ago, in a spirit of trusting dialogue and sincere friendship, which John Paul II said was needed to sustain reason in all its searching. And I want to invite you, the Culture Wars reader and the CAM listener, into that conversation in hopes that together we can move it forward. I want to pose the question again. Why did we go to war in Iraq? But this time I'm not talking about Americans, our representatives in the United States government, or smug elites. I am talking about Catholics. Even if you believe that Jews start all the wars, which is what I hear people saying, we must ask ourselves, why are Catholics and all Christians so easily led, so easily dragged, and so easily duped into fighting them? It's an important question and possibly the only question that we Catholics need to be asking about war at this point in human history. For 20 years, I have been trying to answer it. Perhaps because 2 of the Catholics who fought in that preemptive war, condemned by 2 popes, were my brothers. This is called the railroad switch, all right, this section of the essay, the railroad switch. I am no theologian, I am no scripture scholar either, but I've been teaching ancient literature at a Catholic high school for the past 10 years and conversing with Catholics through my podcast, both on and off the record, for the last 5. So I think I understand well the mindset and the mind style of the average Catholic, and the main problem that I see is cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a psychological term that describes a state of mental discomfort that is felt when people hold conflicting beliefs, or when actions contradict beliefs. Mostly in this essay, I am talking about beliefs, or the intellect, not actions or the will. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote in his famous essay, The Crack-Up, about his midlife crisis, "The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold 2 opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. That should give you some idea of the mental strain that results from cognitive dissonance. The source of cognitive dissonance is Catholic teaching itself, when it's not well explained and thoroughly presented, which it never is. In The Harvest of Justice is Sown in Peace, 1993, the USCCB wrote, "An essential component of a spirituality for peacemaking is an ethic for dealing with conflict in a sinful world. The Christian tradition possesses two ways to address conflict: nonviolence and just war. They both share the common goal to diminish violence in this world. For as we wrote in The Challenge of Peace, the Christian has no choice but to defend peace. This is an inalienable obligation. It is the how of defending peace which offers moral options. Throughout history, there has been a shifting relation between the two streams of the tradition, which always remain in tension." I can tell you that most Catholics don't even know that there are two streams of the tradition, but the bigger problem lies in knowing, because the person who discovers these two streams will immediately perceive that they flow in different directions. The two ways are opposed. There's just no getting around that. I did an interview with David L. Gray at St. Dominic's Media in May, and we were discussing issues of war and violence. A listener commented, "I went on a man's campout with a priest a few weeks ago. One of the men brought his 11-year-old son, and while we sat around the fire, out of the blue, the kid asked, 'Father, Jesus said not to kill, and he told Peter to put down his sword. How can Catholics be in the military?' Wow." I include this anecdote only to illustrate that even an 11-year-old can spot the problem. Now, it's a psychological fact that people will seek to eliminate cognitive dissonance as soon as possible to restore a sense of cognitive consonance. When opposing beliefs are held and cognitive dissonance is experienced, the person will most often attempt to relieve the tension in their mind by dropping or letting go of one of the beliefs. There are three tactics people usually use to accomplish this. By examining them, we can see that we are dealing with cognitive dissonance in the church and not simply issues on which Catholics of goodwill can disagree. Number one, avoidance. People will tend to avoid or ignore people or situations that remind them of the cognitive dissonance, discourage people from talking about it, or distract themselves from it. On an institutional level, the church engages in almost total avoidance. Did you know that seminarians don't spend more than a few hours learning about Catholic teaching on war? I've asked 3 different priests, and they all said the same thing. They talked about just defense, a term I will use instead of just war, for exactly 1 afternoon in seminary, in a philosophy class. Maybe that's why no parish priest ever gives a homily on it. When I asked the seminarians if they had ever been taught anything about the other stream of the tradition, they said no, they had never heard of it, except with respect to like Gandhi or the civil rights movement. For that reason, I will be using the term gospel nonviolence in this essay to distinguish it from mere tactics employed to bring about social change. No, gospel nonviolence is not pacifism, so I will not be using that term either. Calling it pacifism is a form of delegitimizing. After avoidance, we have delegitimizing. When something can't be ignored or avoided, there's an attempt to delegitimize it. People will attempt to ruin the credibility of the person, group, or situation that highlighted the cognitive dissonance. For example, they might say it is untrustworthy or biased. I see this all the time on my podcast. Many Catholics will tell me that gospel nonviolence is a kind of fundamentalism, or that the person espousing it is heterodox, because it goes against the teaching of the church, i.e. just defense. I've been called a heretic, an ignorant Novus Ordo Catholic, a hippie, a liberal, a utopian, someone with a spirit of rebellion against the church, and yes, a pacifist, simply for introducing, explaining, and promoting gospel nonviolence in a serious way. This betrays either widespread confusion about church teaching, the emotional and psychological effects of cognitive dissonance, or both. This is not an ideal state of affairs, especially if these two streams of the tradition are supposed to remain in tension. Number 3, after avoidance and delegitimizing, we have limiting. When Catholics must acknowledge the legitimacy of gospel nonviolence, they try to limit it by belittling its importance. In general, those who limit due to the experience of cognitive dissonance might do this by claiming that certain behaviors or sets of beliefs are a rare or one-off event. I heard that the Just Faith curriculum, popular in Catholic parishes a few years ago, taught gospel nonviolence alongside just defense. I was pleased to hear that, as it would be an improvement upon what is done in most seminaries. I found out, however, that the curriculum taught it only by talking about individuals who had chosen nonviolence as a moral option. This is typical of the limiting strategy in the church. They present someone like Dorothy Day as a kind of curious case study, a rare or one-off event. They might include a selection of quotes from her writings in order to give the nonviolent tradition a nod, but never do they offer a systematic and thorough explanation of that tradition. Another limiting strategy is like when a person tries to provide rational arguments to convince themselves or others that a certain behavior is okay. The epitome of this can be seen in the efforts of some Catholics to justify and rationalize anything and everything that must be done in war, including, for example, the dropping of the atomic bombs on the Japanese people. Now, one would hope that we could look to the official teachings of the Catholic Church to reconcile these two streams of the tradition in such a way that eliminates cognitive dissonance and establishes a healthy tension instead. In my experience, the catechism only causes confusion, especially when you have a classroom full of 14-year-olds who are all flipping through it trying to find proof of their positions. The sections on war and the Fifth Commandment seem like they were hashed out by a committee, like Congress trying to pass a bill. I'll give you your conscientious objection if you give me soldiers contribute to the common good. It feels like it ended up stuffed full of everything everyone wanted in there. It's riddled with contradictions, and it lacks any cohesive organizing principle. It would be almost comical if it weren't so troubling to watch the way kids skim through it. They're like, life is sacred, blah, 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 and God alone is the Lord of life from the beginning to the end, blah, blah, blah. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus recalls the commandment, you shall not, blah, blah, blah. Okay, here it is. Here's the part where it says when you can kill someone. And then that becomes the conversation. Intentionality, innocence, proportionality, those infinitely subjective, infinitely elastic categories of the mind. I learned long ago that the wisdom of the pagans in their ancient epics and tragedies is far more useful, impactful, and instructive when it comes to teaching kids about violence and war. How is it that Homer, Aeschylus, and Sophocles understood more about the first sin committed outside Eden when we have the light of divine revelation and they did not? Because in all the avoidance, delegitimizing, and limiting, we see cognitive dissonance run amok in the church, and I think we all know which moral option or stream of the tradition gets dropped by 99% of Catholics 99% of the time. And I'm not just talking about teenagers. Towards the end of my first interview with Dr. Jones, I brought up Jesus' words, love your enemies. The way he spoke about the Jews worried me, and I wanted to see if I couldn't convince him to take another approach. We barely touched on the topic of Jesus' teachings when he responded, I've had this conversation with other people before. You're supposed to turn the other cheek, okay, right? What if there's a thug there beating up some old lady across the street? He's trying to steal her pocketbook. Wait a minute, honey, turn the other cheek. I'll turn the other cheek for you because I don't want to get involved. Do we turn the other cheek when someone's ready to kidnap your child? We have the right to self-defense here, and we have a cultural equivalent to the right of self-defense. In the interview, when he said this, I just kind of giggled and moved on because we had already been talking for an hour. It was a great conversation, and it just was not the right time to dig in on an entirely new topic, especially one as fraught as this one. But that is exactly where I'd like to pick up that conversation because with all due respect to Dr. Jones, that is exactly the kind of thing that my 14-year-old students would say when I would point out Jesus' teachings in the Gospels. And is this not basically what Israel is saying today? We have the right to self-defense. And what if there's a madman over there in another country building weapons of mass destruction? Do we turn the other cheek because we don't want to get involved? Even Oedipus, who killed his own father unknowingly, appealed to natural law. Answer me this one thing. If here and now someone came up and threatened to take your life, your innocent life, would you then pause to ask if he were your father, or deal with him out of hand? I'm sure as you love life, you'd pay the assailant in his own coin, not look for legal warrant. Straight out of the play of Sophocles. This kind of thinking is entirely natural for a human being. It's to be expected of Jews, pagans, Muslims, secular humanists. Christians will have to grapple with these kinds of questions and concerns too, of course. But for the Christian, they should be considered cliches, predictable objections that invite one to deeper contemplation and a more sophisticated conversation. But does it ever work that way? In my experience, never. Instead, it works like a railroad switch. When these questions, objections, and concerns are encountered, almost always within the context of an imagined hypothetical scenario, the Christian cannot see past them on the Jesus track. In effect, these questions, objections, and concerns act as obstacles that we can't find our way around or through. So for all practical purposes, just defense doctrine ends up short-circuiting thought, diverting us from contemplation of Jesus' teachings, and ultimately becoming an excuse to dispense of them. All thinking from that point forward will be in terms dictated by just defense, and when you cede that ground, you've already lost. On Gemma O'Doherty's podcast, Dr. Jones said, "You better be smarter than the social engineers, because if you're not smarter, they'll destroy you." We have to elevate consciousness all throughout the world, but especially in these Catholic countries. We have to come up with a higher understanding of the world than our enemies. If we don't, they'll destroy us. All right, the next section is called Tension, Confusion, or Delusion, and we are on page 7 of 24 pages. All right, here we go. I couldn't agree more with Dr. Jones in what he's saying here, but what is that higher understanding? Is it just defense doctrine? Is that what we Catholics bring to the table? Because just defense doctrine doesn't even stop us from destroying each other. Protestants and Catholics destroyed each other in Ireland. The Serbs and the Croats destroyed each other in the Balkans. Catholics slaughtered each other by the millions in the Great War, which was at one time called the Great War of Christendom. In the first half of the 20th century, 200,000 bells that had been ringing out across Europe for hundreds of years were melted down and turned into bullets. The bell towers were turned into snipers' nests. Where was the tension between the two streams? Some will, with a shrug, chalk all of this up to sin. Others will say that Christians, innocent as doves, were tricked, having fallen prey to sophisticated wartime propaganda dispensed through the powers of the new mass media, which some say was run, of course, by the Jews. But the fog of war existed long before television and newspapers, as did man's tendency to want to shift blame. One might recall King Agamemnon's speech in the Iliad when he finally reconciles with Achilles after their fight, a fight which put pains thousandfold upon the Achaeans. "This is the word the Achaeans have spoken often against me and found fault with me in it, yet I am not responsible. But Zeus is, and Destiny, and Erinus, the mist-walking, who in assembly caught my heart in savage delusion. Yet what could I do? It is the God who accomplishes all things. Delusion, the elder daughter of Zeus, the accursed who deludes all. Her feet are delicate, and they step not on the firm earth, but she walks the air above men's heads and leads them astray. She has entangled others before me." If it is in fact the Jews who are the accursed who delude all, then why didn't just defense doctrine stop all those Christians from carrying out their will in 2003? According to Iraq body count, there have been 300,000 violent deaths since the invasion of Iraq 20 years ago. It is over 20 years ago. It is estimated that between 187,000 and 211,000 of those people who died were civilians. That's 1/2 to 2/3 of all casualties. Now, Israel is claiming October 7th was our September 11th. In other words, we don't want to hear it. Scandal is an attitude or behavior which leads another to do evil. The just defense theory was initially written to try to limit Christian participation in war. Has it ever worked that way, even in countries not controlled by the Jews? That was in quotes. Today, the white boys see Russia as the last bastion of Christendom, a holdout against global Jewish oligarchical control. I'm repeating what I hear from many people here. Russia completed construction of its main cathedral of the Russian armed forces in 2020. It is a dark, clanging monstrosity of militarism. The main dome is 19.45 meters across to commemorate Russia's victory in World War II. Soviet medals decorate the stained glass ceilings. Key battles are portrayed in mosaic. Everything is coated in metal. The bells made of copper and tin are decorated with military emblems. They weigh 22 tons. The floors are made from weapons and tanks that were seized from the Nazis. According to David Smith's reporting in The Guardian, a tour guide told a group of women in headscarves, "As you walk across the floors of the cathedral, you are symbolically delivering a blow to the fascist enemy." 20,000 visitors a day, most of them presumably Christians, can envision that blow to the enemy while the largest icon of Christ's face ever created in mosaic looks down on them from the central dome up above, without experiencing even the slightest pang of conscience. Why? Is there any better proof that just defense doctrine has become, operationally speaking, I'm not talking about philosophically speaking, I'm talking about operationally speaking in reality, an artful, quote, an artful dodge whereby Christians try to fool themselves and the whole human community by morally rubber stamping homicide in the name of Jesus on behalf of their particular kingdom. That's from the book Christian Just War Theory, The Logic of Deceit by Father McCarthy. Maybe this is why Pope Benedict XVI at one point called the just war doctrine a problem, quote, a problem, and said, quote, "We should be asking ourselves if it is licit to even suggest the existence of a just war in this day and age," unquote. Here's a thought that will not be popular. Maybe the Jews are not more depraved than we are. Maybe they are just more honest with themselves and with the world about the nature of violence and the realities of war. I interviewed an American veteran on my podcast in May of this year who was defending Israel. I said that what Israel was doing was not proportional. He said proportionality is stupid in war and that the Americans tried to fight a proportional war in Iraq and Afghanistan and it went on for 20 years and ended up being the worst in the long run. He said war is hell, so you should want it to be over with as soon as possible, which means you fight to win. I said Israel is committing genocide. He said no, they are fighting until they render the aggressor unable to do harm. I asked him if he was a Christian, and he said yes, but I'm not speaking from that perspective. What could I say? If we're not speaking from that perspective, then we lose all orientation, don't we? It had never been so obvious to me as it was in this conversation that just defense, whether it be Christian or Jewish or whatever, was, quote, simply one of the accoutrements of war, a normal part of the propaganda process that nations employ in the process of prosecuting a war and persuading people to give their children, their money, and their lives to the reciprocal butchery of human beings, unquote. That's also from Christian Just War Theory, The Logic of Deceit. I'll say this much for the Jews. At least they are not trying to rubber stamp homicide in the name of Jesus. I'll give them that. Can we blame Israel for choosing the just defense track when they literally have no other track because they are Jews? Can we blame them if once they start down that track, they have to tweak a few things here and there, like the rules about proportionality? just as Christians have always had to do to bring our abstract philosophies about justified killing more in line with reality. Christians took the just defense track around the time of Constantine, and 1 mile down that track, thou shalt not kill became thou shalt not kill unless you're wearing a military uniform. 10 miles down that track, it became thou shalt not kill with a gun, only with a sword. Thou shalt not kill has always implied thou shalt not kill the innocent, but 30 miles down the track, soldiers had stopped killing each other in fields, and every war started to entail massive civilian casualties, i.e. deaths. So the world coined the term collateral damage, and the church, ever accommodating, changed thou shalt not kill the innocent to thou shalt not kill the innocent directly. 40 miles down the track, that became thou shalt not kill the innocent indiscriminately. Now, in the 21st century, thou shalt not kill has morphed into thou shalt not commit genocide. How far we've come. Is there not more than an echo of the serpent in all of this? The serpent who is described in Genesis as being more subtle than any other creature, and asks Eve, did God say you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? Did God say thou shalt not kill under any circumstances? With this new commandment, thou shalt not commit genocide, we are further diverted from talking about the real issues Christians should be concerned with, the teachings of Jesus, and we instead get to argue with the rest of the world about the definition of genocide, asking questions like, is it okay to kill 200,000 people over 20 years, which equates to 10,000 people a year, but it's not okay to kill 40,000 people over 8 months, which equates to 60,000 people a year? But what if Israel ends up stopping after a year? Then you only have 60,000 people dead instead of 200,000. Isn't that better? So doesn't the American veteran that I interviewed kind of have a point? Maybe Catholic mathematicians should update the just defense doctrine with an equation that specifies what velocity of killing is just and unjust. Or maybe we should be concerned with the number of people killed compared to the total population. But in that case, would you count only Palestinians living in Gaza or those living all over the world? Maybe Catholic scientists can mine the genetic databases so we can add something to the catechism about how many people of each race and ethnicity can be killed in a war without committing a war crime. Or does the killing on both sides have to be proportional? As of this writing, 40,000 Palestinians have died since October 7th, or so they say, and only 1,200 Israelis. So that's a 33-to-1 ratio. If about 200,000 Iraqis died compared to 7,000 American troops in the war in Iraq, then that's a 29-to-1 ratio, and we're not much better than the Israelis. Well, what if we count American contractor deaths in the Iraq war? That would bring the American casualties up to 15,000, which would make for a 1-to-13 ratio. We could even throw in the 30,000 suicides among American veterans of that war to bring the ratio down to 1-to-4. But then do you count the deaths of pregnant Iraqi women as 2 instead of 1? What does the just war theory say about that? Of course not. The killing of the unborn only matters when it's done by Planned Parenthood, not when it's done by a Christian drone pilot or a bomb signed by Nikki Haley. Because in the first case, it's direct killing, and in the second, it's indirect. But then, do you count the deformed babies from all the uranium bombs? What about the Iraqi kid I once met, whose face was burned off, who had to listen to his mother's screams as she burned to death in a car? Does he count for anything? Do his psychological wounds count? Well, that can surely be... Oh, what about the children that his mother would have borne if she had not died? How do we count that? Well, that can surely be balanced out by the 1,367 American veterans who suffered permanent injuries to their genitals and were therefore never able to have any or any more children. How do you measure evil? How do you qualify it? quantify it, weigh it, balance it. Luckily, we can look to the UN for clarity. It's not about the numbers at all, actually. The UN says, quote, "To constitute genocide, there must be a proven intent on the part of the perpetrators to physically destroy a nation, a national, ethnic, or racial or religious group. Cultural destruction does not suffice, nor does an intention to simply disperse a group." So, we're back to the idea of intention. Now, how do you prove intent, especially when, quote, "the act of self-defense can have a double effect, the preservation of one's own life and the killing of the aggressor. The one is intended, the other is not." Catechism, section 2263. Well, now that takes us right back to self-defense, Catechism 2264. It's a Russian doll of rationality. People are still arguing about how many Jews really died in World War II and whether Hitler intended to genocide them. Maybe Catholic neurologists can team up with Elon Musk to invent a brain chip that reads intentions. We can install them in all the political leaders of the world, and then maybe, just maybe, the just war doctrine will work as it was intended. But wait, let's say that we could prove intent. Are we talking about the intentions at the beginning of a war, in the middle, or at the end? And whose intentions matter, the politicians or the soldiers who are fighting the war? The Trojan soldiers started out fighting in self-defense, but 10 years later, a character in the Iliad named Antenor the Thoughtful, my favorite, says, "Let us give back Helen of Argos and all her possessions to the sons of Atreus, seeing now that we fight with our true pledges turned into lies," unquote. It seems that something changed during the course of 10 long years. There are actually stories in the Iliad about Achilles at the beginning of the war when he was a very noble person, treating his enemies with honor and respect. But by the end, he is abusing corpses and slaughtering so many Trojans that the river itself turns red from all the blood. Xanthus, the river itself, is a river god, and he stands up to Achilles. But even this river god is concerned with self-defense. The pagan gods are always projections of the human psyche, of course. Now swift Achilles would have killed even more Paeonians, except that the deep whirling river spoke to him in anger. The voice rose from the depths of the eddies. "O Achilles, your strength is greater, your acts more violent than all men's, since always the very gods are guarding you. If the son of Cronos has given all Trojans to your destruction, drive them at least out of me to the plain, and there wreak your havoc. For the loveliness of my waters is crammed with corpses. I cannot find a channel to cast my waters into the bright sea, since I am congested with the dead men you kill so brutally. Let me alone then, Lord of the people, I am confounded." Achilles tells Xanthus, "I will not leave off my killing." Then Xanthus rises on him in a darkening edge of water. The next section is called the Ancient Eddy. We're on page 11 out of 24 pages. Sorry. Okay, here we go. If our preemptive aggressive invasion of a foreign land that lasted 15 years and killed almost 250,000 people can be justified in terms of self-defense, and a war that killed 75 million people can be referred to by Christians as the good war, I don't think we're going to be able to appeal to reason or the moral law to try to convince Israel that what they are doing does not meet the sniff test. I don't mean, by the way, I'm not defending Israel here. I'm trying to make a point. Frankly, if we American Catholics think that we can lecture anyone about justified killing or about the moral law or about how God is the author of life from beginning to end, or how about all life is sacred, I call to mind the words of Dr. Jones from that 2019 podcast. "This is delusion," he yelled as he leaned forward, pointing at his brain. And good luck trying to convince a woman that she shouldn't have an abortion, by the way. After all, she intends to end the pregnancy, not kill the baby. You've heard that before, right? It's called double effect. But the baby is innocent, you say. So she's not doing it indiscriminately. She gave birth to her first 5 kids. She just doesn't want to have any more. Did God ever say a woman should be forced to have a baby? Even Mary was given a choice. In the article, that's written in italics in the same way that the Satan was speaking in the Garden of Eden. The only hint of double effect that I can find in the Gospels, by the way, is in Matthew 26:52. Those who live by the sword die by the sword. Think about how different this is from the double effect described in the Catechism, especially when it is preceded in the Gospel by the words, "Put down your sword." How simple, how clear, how unambiguous. Simone Weil, in her brilliant essay about the Iliad, understands double effect. Such is the nature of force. Its power of converting a man into a thing is double, and in its application, double-edged. To the same degree, though in different fashions, those who use it and those who endure it are turned to stone. Maybe this petrifactive effect, as she calls it, explains all the suicides. There's nothing about that in the section on war in the Catechism either. Weil writes, I don't know if her name is pronounced Weil or Whale. Simone Weil writes, Simone Weil, I think that's writes, quote, "Force is pitiless to the man who possesses it or thinks he does, as it is to its victims. The second, it crushes. The first, it intoxicates." This is depicted in every great film or play or story about war that's ever been written or performed. I know there is something in the Catechism about how sin creates proclivity to sin, but that appears in a different section. I guess they can't put it right next to all the war stuff because then someone might confuse rendering the unjust aggressor unable to do harm with sin. Why men still suffer the devastating effects of sin when all they are supposedly doing is rendering the unjust aggressor unable to do harm is beyond me, and a question that the Catechism fails to address. I am so sick of hearing people say with a tone of gritty realism, "War is hell." That has become the worst cliche of all. Hell is the absence of God, a place filled with evil. If we Catholics believed that war is hell, if we really believed that, we wouldn't see it as a cure or any kind of option, even as a last resort, because we Christians know we cannot control evil and we certainly cannot outsmart evil. We can't even seem to outsmart the social engineers who keep sending us off to war. We certainly cannot do evil in order to bring about good. Father Walter H. Halloran was a Jesuit priest. He took part in the exorcism upon which the book and the film The Exorcist were based. He was also a paratrooper chaplain in Vietnam. He is reported to have said, "I saw more evil in Vietnam than I ever did in that boy's bedroom." I believe it. So why do we think we can seek the kingdom of God by participating in hell on earth? We must be just like the pagans in the chorus in the play Agamemnon, who repeat the line over and over, "Cry, sorrow, sorrow, yet let good prevail." They come across as so helpless, so impotent, so stuck. There are no streams of the tradition. That's what I think. There is no just war, as far as I can see. There exists no war that meets the criteria for both jus ad bellum and jus in bello, outside of our own minds. And there is no gospel nonviolence in our minds, and therefore there is none in practice. So these two streams of the tradition are more like an eddy, a very dark, very stagnant, very ancient eddy. Neither is a channel that helps us cast our waters into the bright sea. The just defense track is too crammed with corpses, and the gospel nonviolence track, it's all fogged up. We don't even know where it leads or whether they've even laid down all the track. Nobody wants to go there. We've heard that some people who do, they never come back. It's too scary. And it's too scary for us. And as Catholics, it's scarier even apparently, than the prospect of World War III. It seems we're far more comfortable with the prospect of a nuclear holocaust than we are with considering that maybe we should pay attention to what Jesus said. The truth is mind's conformance to reality. If we Catholics are content to let the situation just remain as it is, then we should at least stop saying, war is hell, and we should start saying instead, war is a festival. It would be more honest. Freud defined a festival as a permitted, or rather an obligatory excess, a column breach of a prohibition. In this case, the prohibition against killing. This is why governments are so eager to label anything a war. All the better if there is no clear endpoint, because in war there are different rules. If we're being honest, war is the last pagan festival, more like, in the words of Freud, a sacrificial custom whose virtue lies ultimately in its very impiety. Think about how we say war is hell on the one hand, and then we have to praise the soldier for his sacrifice and service on the other. René Girard wrote, "Sacrifice and festival are one in the same rite. This mechanism provides the only feasible explanation of how a sacrificial murder, originally regarded as a crime, can literally be transformed into an act of piety." As you walk across the floors of the cathedral in your headscarf, you are symbolically delivering a blow to the fascist enemy. Again, one of the reasons we all love E. Michael Jones is that he doesn't equivocate. He also happens to be a great listener if you have something to say. All of this makes him someone you can talk to and dialogue with. But I fear that because of your own level of intelligence and intellectual honesty, Dr. Jones, you put a little too much stock in human reason and philosophy as a means of elevating consciousness for humanity. The pagans understood better than we do, I think, that reason is corrupted by sin. In Aeschylus's Orestean trilogy, Clytemnestra is trying to justify her act of killing her husband, armed with all the usual arguments and appeals to justice. And the chorus, who knows that what she did is wrong, responds, where lies right? Reason despairs her powers. Mind numbly gropes, her quick resources spent. René Girard put this in his own words when he said, I paraphrase, "People are often loath to admit that the reasons used to justify violence on both sides of a conflict are equally valid." King Oedipus killed not only his father, the former king, but 3 other men who were traveling with the king. When I ask my students why, they often say, he snapped and he went crazy. But Oedipus killed 3 people not because he went crazy or because he was a psychopath, but because once he had killed the king, he had to kill the other 3 men, so they couldn't take revenge on him for killing the king. It is the nature of violence to escalate. Simone Weil writes, "A moderate use of force, which alone would enable a man to escape being enmeshed in its machinery, would require a superhuman virtue, which is as rare as dignity in weakness." I'm going to read that again. A moderate use of force, which alone would enable a man to escape being enmeshed in its machinery, would require a superhuman virtue, which is as rare as dignity in weakness. Dignity in weakness sounds to me a lot like the cross, which was a scandal to the Jews and foolishness to the Greeks. Is it any less scandalous and foolish to us, we Americans who spend more on defense than the next 7 countries combined? Do the Russians find dignity in weakness? Does Israel? Does the just defense doctrine simply assume that men who have responsibility for the common good, section 2309, will exercise this superhuman virtue as a matter of routine? If the followers of Christ like George Bush can't even do it, how do we expect Jewish leaders like Bibi Netanyahu to do it? And if the leaders who take us into war can't do it, how do we expect the guys with the boots on the ground to be able to pull that off? I saw one clear theme stand out at the Republican National Convention this year. Fight, fight, fight. These were Trump's spontaneous words after supposedly being saved by God from a 20-year-old assassin's bullet and allowed an incredible photo opportunity in the process. The words fight, fight, fight were echoed by Kid Rock and then chanted by the entire crowd. But fight for whom? Fight for what? This is the question the Hitler-loving white boys will have to answer when they get drafted to go fight World War III. The perennial question of war. Whose side is God on? Should I die for the gay disco? Or defect to Russia and fight alongside the Nazis' historical enemies? This part about the white boys is going to be understood more by people who are familiar with Culture Wars and Dr. Jones's show and everything like that. There has never been a more confusing time to kill. But there are some things that are not confusing. It says in the Catechism, the prohibition of murder does not abrogate the right to render an unjust aggressor unable to inflict harm. Actually, you might have to read that twice. Anyway, who gets to determine who the unjust aggressor is? Oedipus says, I do. Who gets to determine when that unjust aggressor is no longer unable to inflict harm? Israel claims, we do. All of this is almost enough to make you wonder if maybe Jesus wasn't the ultimate realist, and if the just defense doctrine, which he did not teach, is actually the thing that has caught Christian hearts in a savage delusion and walks the air above men's heads, leading them astray. A person could learn more about the human condition, the nature of violence, and the machinations of evil from reading 10 lines in Sophocles or one play by Aeschylus than they ever could from reading the Church's teaching on just defense and the Fifth Commandment. Aristotle said the heart of tragedy is man fallen into misery, not due to vice or depravity, but due to some error. John Paul II wrote in Fides et Ratio, this is the human condition vividly described by the book of Genesis when it tells us that God placed the human being in the Garden of Eden, in the middle of which there stood the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The symbol is clear. Man was in no position to discern and decide for himself what was good and what was evil, but was constrained to appeal to a higher source. The blindness of pride deceived our first parents into thinking themselves sovereign and autonomous, and into thinking that they could ignore the knowledge which comes from God. All men and women were caught up in this primal disobedience, which so wounded reason that from then on its path to full truth would be strewn with obstacles. From that time onward, the human capacity to know the truth was impaired by an aversion to the one, capital O, who is the source and origin of truth. I'm going to say that again. From that time onwards, the human capacity to know the truth was impaired by an aversion, aversion, to the one who is the source and origin of truth. It is again the apostle who reveals just how far human thinking, because of sin, became empty, and human reasoning became distorted and inclined to falsehood. The eyes of the mind were no longer able to see clearly. Reason became more and more a prisoner to itself. The coming of Christ was the saving event which redeemed reason for its weakness, setting it free from the shackles in which it had imprisoned itself. The next section is called Our Polar Night. We're on page 15 of 24. The Latin verb I don't know how to say it. The Latin verb orior means to rise. It is associated with the east because the first thing a pilgrim has to do in the morning is orient him or herself by the direction of the sun. Daylight can help you to see clearly, but only the sun can tell you which way to go. Consider that there are places on the earth in times of the year when the sun never sets, nor will it pass overhead. Instead, it will appear to move from left to right across the horizon, and the sun will remain visible even at midnight. During a polar night, the sun will remain hidden all day, and the observer will experience something like a constant blue twilight, as the sun's light can only be refracted through clouds, sea, and snow. The sun's path across the sky, whether it be high or low, as well as the length of time it will appear above the horizon, is determined by the axial tilt of the earth, the time of the year, and the latitude at which the observer is standing. We are living in a time when Logos is indeed rising, but the trajectory of its arc, and therefore the degree to which it will be able to light and warm the earth, remains to be seen, because we Christians are disoriented. We can't see the way, and frankly, that makes us kind of dumb. The effects of cognitive dissonance are that devastating, spiritually, globally, and eternally. This state of affairs poses a threat to the salvation of souls because first and foremost, our Lord Jesus Christ taught a way of nonviolent love of friends and enemies. This way is what he taught. This way is what he lived. This way is how he died. Nobody can deny that. Surely we are meant to grapple with this mystery and not disregard it, avoid it, compartmentalize it, minimize it, or rationalize it away for fear of its implications. By now, it can no longer really be argued that Jesus did not teach a way of nonviolent love because he told his apostles to buy a sword, or because he turned over the tables in the temple, or because the God of the Old Testament was called upon to help people smite their enemies. All of these objections are mere cliches at this point. The scholarship on all of this has already been done, and this issue is settled. This is another assertion that I don't really have time to thoroughly back up in this essay. It would require a book, but I'll offer one quick point. Father John L. Mackenzie, one of the most preeminent Catholic theologians of the 20th century, wrote, "If we cannot know that Jesus was nonviolent, we can know nothing of his person. It is the clearest of teachings." I think of the line by one of my favorite singer-songwriters, Nico Case. "It was so clear to me that it was almost invisible." Gospel nonviolence is the older stream of the tradition, the original stream, and is the presumptive stance of the Church. Just defense is supposed to be the exception, not the rule. It attempts to carve out very specific criteria that must be strictly applied in order for a Christian to be able to justify going to war. Nobody, including St. Ambrose and St. Augustine, ever said that the criteria could be met. Furthermore, St. Augustine said that it was only a theory of state, and that if a person was individually threatened, he must die in imitation of his Creator. Yet the just defense doctrine is considered by most Catholics to be normative, while gospel nonviolence is regarded as an eccentric choice or a moral option that a Catholic would consider only when he's totally out of options, outnumbered, outsmarted, or outgunned. The cognitive dissonance experienced by followers of Jesus results in a situation of diabolical reversal. In doing so, it allows Christians to become mentally captivated by something other than the way, the truth, and the life that Jesus came to reveal. This means the conscience cannot be properly formed, which assures that the Christian's processes of moral reasoning will be handicapped, stunted, and severely impeded. Another way of thinking about this is, theology is the queen of the sciences and philosophy is her handmaid. When gospel nonviolence gets dropped, there's no tension in the mind between theology and philosophy, and Catholics default to a purely philosophical way of thinking about violence based on natural law that no longer stands in its proper relationship to divine law or revelation, and I would argue actually has very little relationship to the realities and violence of war. Let's not pretend that just war doctrine is the product of the tension between the two streams. Cicero came up with the first just war doctrine before God became flesh. It's a work of philosophy, it's the product of human reasoning, and it really has no reference to anything that Jesus ever said or did in the Gospels. Now, once the tension gets dropped, what makes the Catholic any different from the pagan or the Jew? To quote Pope Benedict XVI, For philosophy, listening to the great experiences and insights of the Christian faith in particular is a source of knowledge, and to ignore it would be an unacceptable restriction. Once his moral reasoning is short-circuited, the Catholic becomes casually dismissive of, if not smugly contemptuous of, Jesus' teachings. Imagine that 11-year-old kid sitting by the fire and the priest explaining just defense doctrine to him. The kid says, "But Jesus says it right there. If you try to save your life in this world, you will lose it. But if you lose your life for my sake and the sake of the Gospels, you will save it." And the priest says, "Don't worry, kid. Jesus isn't talking about your biological life. He's talking about the things that you have an unhealthy attachment to, like your wealth or your reputation or your favorite Lego set." "Are you sure, Father? Because I found this other part where Jesus says, 'Do not worry about those who can kill the body, but worry about those who can kill both the body and the soul.'" Well, if you want to let yourself get killed, kid, I suppose that's your choice. But the Church teaches in Catechism section 2265 that legitimate defense can be not only a right, but a grave duty for the one who is responsible for the lives of others. You can't just stand by and let people get slaughtered. "I know, Father, but Jesus did say, 'Love your enemies.'" But in the Catechism section 2264, it says love towards oneself remains a fundamental principle of morality. And just because you're throwing a grenade at your enemy and shredding them to pieces doesn't mean you don't love them. Man, how I wish this kid would respond to that priest with a line from Oedipus Rex. "Wag on, smart tongue. I've never met an honest man subtle in argument." But it's likely that this kid will simply drop the teachings of Jesus and will never take Jesus seriously again, nor will he ever take the church seriously again. Is it any wonder that Catholic kids are still marching off to go fight in every war the government tells them is necessary, despite 100 years of strongly worded cautionary letters issued from the See of Peter? Like every other Catholic, that kid will adopt the kind of thinking that goes like this: life is sacred, blah, 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 and God alone is the Lord of life from beginning to end, blah, blah, blah. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus recalls the commandment, "You shall not, blah, blah, blah." But in the end, you got to do what you got to do. And I'll decide for myself what I got to do based on what the government tells me I have to do, because at least what the government tells me I have to do, it makes some kind of logical sense. And I'll interpret all of that gobbledygook in the Catechism for myself. Thank you very much. At this point, he's pretty much putty in the hands of the war planners and the social engineers. All they will have to do is convince him, if you don't do this, something worse will happen. We have to do the bad thing to prevent the worst thing from happening. So the bad thing is not really a bad thing. It's good, you see? And of course, no one can see the future. So nobody can really prove that the worst thing would have happened, or that if it did happen, it would even be worse than if it didn't, because no one can measure or quantify evil. But you've got him in a double bind. He'll start thinking like the pagan king Agamemnon, who wasn't too bright, when he was contemplating the bad thing he had to do in order to get the wind to sail to Troy. "What can I say? Disaster follows if I disobey. Surely yet worse disaster if I yield." In the words of King Agamemnon, who I remind you wasn't too bright, "May good prevail and justify my deed." Then he put on the harness of necessity. A harness is something that is used to control an animal. Isn't that one of the meanings of the word goy? And notice it wasn't put on him by some god, he put it on himself. So was it really done out of necessity, or was it a choice? Aeschylus was a veteran of war, and a proud one at that, and even he seems to want us to think about this. John Paul II writes, "Men and women are always called to direct their steps toward a truth which transcends them. Sundered from that truth, individuals are at the mercy of caprice." Sundered from that, Aeschylus describes the moment when the Greeks choose to ignore the prohibition against killing the innocent. in order to get the wind to sail to Troy. Aeschylus matches EMJ in his bluntness when he assesses the situation. They valued more their glory and their war. Trump is freedom, white boys. Freedom is Trump. That is all ye need to know. That is all ye know, and that is all ye need to know. We are told by the USCCB that there are two streams of the tradition which always remain in tension. Where is the tension? There is no tension. How can you have tension between two things when one of them is either entirely unknown by 99% of Catholics, or once it's introduced, it's dropped as the result of cognitive dissonance? You can't have tension. Just defense doctrine is a philosophical idea based on natural law, and let's face it, it rules the day because it appeals to common sense. And in comparison, gospel nonviolence, when not taught well, sounds to the average person like a Freudian death wish. But what if that's because we don't understand gospel nonviolence? And if we don't understand it, how can we ever act on it? And what happens if we fail to act on it? This is dangerous. St. Paul warned us, "See to it that no one captivate you with an empty, seductive philosophy according to human tradition, according to the elemental powers of the world, and not according to Christ." Colossians 2:8. The next section is called The Hidden Grammar of the Hidden Grammar of the Universe. And I think this is the last section. We are on page 18 out of 24. This is a quote from E. Michael Jones on Gemma Doherty's podcast. "Aristotle didn't know the world was created, but now that we understand the world, you can look at the world and understand there's beauty there because God created it. And if you look at it long enough, you will be able to imitate that. Art is imitation of nature. You will be able to imitate that and create beauty in your world." That's what happened here. So if it weren't for that crucifix, we wouldn't have it. It wouldn't happen because it provided protection. It provides an organizing principle. It allows you to tear into the hidden grammar of the universe, which is logos. Thesis, the logos, this is the logos incarnate. It's Europe. And what are we in the process of doing? What's the wicked American empire in the process of doing? Turning all of these states into vassal states whose main purpose is to provide cannon fodder for some war that some Jew wants to have. We have to be able to break away from this control. And what am I talking about? A philosophical understanding of the Catholic faith, of the depths of reality." Unquote. I agree with Dr. Jones completely, but he's not gone far enough. I realize that I am the first person in the history of the world to ever utter the words E. Michael Jones has not gone far enough. I want to propose a few ways this situation can be rectified, short of the Pope calling an ecumenical council and abolishing just defense doctrine forever, which I would personally support. But no, I do not expect that my remedies will end war or abolish human violence from the face of the earth. I do think they could create conditions in which it will be easier for Christians to know, love, and serve the Lord, preach the gospel, and bear witness to the truth, which is what we are called to do. Consistency, after all, is key to credible witness. First, we must no longer practice avoidance. If the 20th century didn't teach us the price we pay for avoidance of this whole thing, I don't know what will. Some people seem to think that we can get away with continuing to avoid the topic of gospel nonviolence as long as we do a better job of teaching just war doctrine. That's not true. I can make this statement because, as I said before, both of my own brothers fought in the preemptive war in Iraq. One of them majored in math and philosophy before becoming an officer in the Marine Corps and going to Iraq in 2003. He is extremely intelligent. I found out years later that the topic of his senior year philosophy thesis was just war theory. The problem was not that he didn't get it. I think the problem was that just war theory, as it was called then, was not taught alongside gospel nonviolence, so he couldn't see them in relief. He was never given the chance to compare the two. For him, as for most Catholics, nonviolence was a non-thought. Sometimes I have to wonder if this is not done intentionally so as to keep Catholics in an Edenic state of invincible ignorance. Second, the relationship between these two streams of the tradition is described by the USCCB as shifting. So let's allow it to shift dramatically, like dramatically enough to correct the state of diabolical reversal that I previously explained. In my experience, Catholics tend to believe that everything in the Catechism has equal weight and is permanently frozen, which is not true. Many Catholics don't understand the difference between dogma and doctrine, or tradition with a capital T and tradition with a lowercase t, otherwise known as custom. This is the root of the confusion, and as soon as you clear that up, a large part of the cognitive dissonance with regard to church teaching on violence and war tends to resolve itself. And Catholics are better able to see how the Holy Spirit guides the church without putting its permanent stamp of infallible approval on everything ever uttered or written by someone in the church. I have found that the best way to address this issue and clear up confusion is to educate Catholics about the 8 levels of acceptance and certainty in the church. Now, I actually don't know if the church has officially stamped the just defense doctrine with a certain level, but it seems safe to assume that just defense doctrine would fall somewhere on the 7th or 8th level of certainty, especially when you consider the following quote that appeared in La Civiltà Cattolica in 1991. Quote, "It becomes clear that theology has sustained the theory of just war for many centuries, a theory which, however, never became official, which was never blessed by the magisterium of the church." Unquote. More quotes like this, which speak about the standing of the doctrine in the church, must be found, collected, and then widely circulated, and then researched by people who are smarter than me to figure out what is the deal here. How could that have been written in a publication that is officially approved by the Vatican? Sustained for centuries without being blessed? Let's not tell that to the 11-year-old boy who's sitting by the fire. He might end up throwing that catechism in the fire. Let's just tell the 11-year-old boy that Jesus' teachings are way, way, way up here in terms of levels of certainty, and the just defense doctrine is way down here, because Jesus was God, and whoever wrote the just defense doctrine was not. That will go a long way toward correcting things. Moreover, when teaching both streams of the tradition, we don't really need to give them equal time. The 4 hours that they are spending on just defense doctrine in seminaries, come to think about it, is probably too much. Since just defense doctrine can easily be grasped by any 14-year-old in about 10 minutes, oh look, here's the part where it says when you can kill someone. We should give it about 10 minutes of teaching. Gospel nonviolence is based on the Gospels, which is of infinite depth. A person can wrestle with it, investigate it, ponder it in their heart for years, even decades. Whereas just defense doctrine applies only in certain situations which, let's face it, most Catholics will never find themselves in, and situations which Pope Benedict XVI seemed to imply could be non-existent, gospel nonviolence can be applied moment to moment in everyday life according to the 11th commandment, love one another as I have loved you. Therefore, it makes sense that gospel nonviolence be given more time than just defense, more time and attention, not less. Third, we need to legitimize gospel nonviolence, which means we need to legitimize those who question and critique just defense doctrine, which is what Pope Benedict said 20 years ago we should be doing. That sounds like a moral imperative to me. A man named Ben Salmon did this very thing over 100 years ago, back in 1917 during World War I. Before Iraq was invaded, before the CIA was created, before we understood things like PTSD and moral injury, before the UN defined war crimes, before the atomic bomb was built, and before Hitler and the Holocaust. A devout Catholic, Ben Salmon, said, "There is no such animal as just war." For this, and for registering as a conscientious objector, the Knights of Columbus kicked him out of their club. The secular authorities arrested him, and when he wouldn't capitulate, sent him to a mental hospital, where he was put in a ward for the criminally insane and asked to write a history of his mental illness, which is what it was considered back then, when a Christian took an absolute stand against killing. If Benedict did not mean to advocate the critiquing and questioning of the just war doctrine itself, then he must have meant we should at least be questioning its applicability to real life in the real world at this stage in history. Now, that's exactly what Blessed Franz Jägerstätter did when he refused to fight for Hitler in World War II, because he said Hitler was fighting an unjust war. Franz Jägerstätter didn't fare much better. His fellow Christians beheaded him, surely out of self-defense. It should be perfectly acceptable to question and critique the just defense doctrine given its low level of acceptance and certainty in the Church, and after taking honest stock of its fruits. Those who do so in a spirit of critical enquiry should not be accused of failing to adhere to the guidance of the magisterium, disregarding the Church's teaching on faith and morals, or setting him or herself against the teachings of the Church, as I have been accused many times, and I know Father McCarthy has as well. No Catholic is obligated to show assent of intellect and will to the just defense doctrine, period. Now, if anybody thinks I'm wrong about this, please correct me. I want to be corrected. Correct me. But if that statement is untrue, let me know. But I'm fairly certain that nobody is obliged to subscribe to it or believe in it. So we need to stop treating just defense doctrine like a sacred cow and gospel nonviolence like a potential contaminant in the Church. We need to engage critics of the just defense doctrine rather than trying to delegitimize and silence them. After all, who was on the right side of history? Ben Salmon and Franz Jägerstätter, or their persecutors? Let us, like the pagans and these 20th century prophets, embrace a spirit of critical inquiry surrounding the issue. Sometimes the most important questions are the most basic ones. In the words of Aeschylus's chorus, cry, sorrow, sorrow, yet let good prevail. But who is good? And, cry, sorrow, sorrow, yet let good prevail. But what is good? And who is God? Fourth, we need to give people a philosophical understanding of the Catholic faith and of the depths of reality, and we cannot do that without teaching gospel nonviolence, because Jesus is Logos, and that is what Jesus taught. We need to teach it actively, and we need to teach it well. If just defense doctrine can be taught as a set of philosophical propositions that make logical sense, we should be able to teach gospel nonviolence in that same way, systematically and philosophically, not as a rare one-off event. Only then can people see how and why the teachings of Jesus are theological and not utopian, silly, or unrealistic. 7 years ago, Pope Francis said on the 50th anniversary of the World Day of Peace that, quote, to be true followers of Jesus today also includes embracing his teachings about nonviolence, unquote. Well, you can't embrace something that you've never heard of and don't understand and have never been taught anything about. Fifth, let us not be afraid to teach gospel nonviolence. Pope St. John Paul II said in his Day of Peace message on January 1st, 1979, to everyone, Christians, believers, and men and women of goodwill, I say, do not be afraid to take a chance on peace, to teach peace. When I first read this, I thought it was strange. Why would someone be afraid to teach peace? But after 10 years of trying to do just that, I have a better understanding. In Fides et Ratio, Pope John Paul II wrote, the natural limitation of reason and the inconstancy of the heart often obscure and distort a person's search for the truth. Truth can also drown in a welter of other concerns. People can even run from the truth as soon as they glimpse it because they are afraid of its demands, unquote. An example of a welter of other concerns. I was recently trying to get my gospel nonviolence curriculum approved by the Archdiocese of Denver so I could teach it in my parish. I figure if I'm going to preach this, I should try to do it, right? Well, after many months of review, the chancellor in the Archdiocese told me that he thought it would, quote, not be prudent to present in a parish setting as there would be too many potential pitfalls for the average parishioner, unquote. So I guess World War III and more Catholics slaughtering each other and killing each other, and that's not a potential pitfall that he's worried about. In other words, what I think the chancellor was trying to say is, we don't really want to open this can of worms, so let's just avoid it. So going back to that whole avoidance thing, that's what he wanted to do. By this, I think he meant that it would create too much cognitive dissonance and would make people start questioning the just war doctrine and would therefore make the church look bad. One can't always, side note, I also tried to teach this at a Catholic school once, and they wouldn't let me because I was using Father McCarthy's materials. And I said, is there anything that's not true in these materials that doesn't jibe with church doctrine? And they said, no, it's not really like what he's saying, it's just like who he is. We can't use his materials. And I said, well, who is he? And the answer basically came down to the fact that he is someone who critiques the just war doctrine. So do you see that kind of like loop there? It's like if you want to teach gospel nonviolence, you kind of have to critique the just defense doctrine and show these two things in relief. But if you do that, then you can't teach gospel nonviolence. And in my view, when you study them both together, you actually have a much better understanding of just defense doctrine than if you just read the catechism and look at the just defense doctrine alone. But I digress. One can't always overcome these welters of other concerns, but I do think it's possible to help people overcome fear. We can remind people that man has the right to act in conscience and in freedom so as personally to make moral decisions. He must not be forced to act contrary to his conscience, nor must he be prevented from acting according to his conscience, especially in religious matters. That's Catechism 1782. So if you encounter a situation where you feel you must use violence, like if an old granny is getting mugged or something, you can go with your conscience, but your job as a Christian is to form your conscience, and that is what the learning about gospel nonviolence is all about. So you should have no fear of its demands. We should actually be afraid not to teach gospel nonviolence. After all, our Lord didn't just say, go be baptized, or go baptize people. That's a good first step, but then what? He said, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey all that I have commanded you. And when Jesus told the servants to go fill the jars with water, which would have made absolutely no logical sense, Mary said, do whatever he tells you. Sixth, let us not forget that Logos is the good, the true, and the beautiful. Christ is the Prince of Peace. When we imitate Christ, we create beauty in our world. Beauty attracts. There is only one bishop that I know of in the United States who not only spoke out against the Iraq War in 2003, but sent his people a letter telling them it was an unjust war and that they were not allowed to fight in it. Imagine if every bishop had done this. His name is Bishop John Botine. A listener of my podcast wrote to me, I appreciate your work. You read Bishop Botine's Lenten exhortation. Seeing that he and the Pope opposed the wars in the 2000s helped bring me back to the church. When I sent this message to the bishop, he responded, thanks, Ellen. I continue to be amazed that that letter keeps showing up. We have a whole new group of members at our cathedral because of it. Now that's what I call Logos rising. Invitation. This is the last section. We're on page 22. As I mentioned before, there are places on earth in times of the year when the sun remains visible even at midnight, and other places in times when the sun never appears at all. What is so interesting is that in winter, when certain places are experiencing their polar night, and the surface of the earth is dark and cold, the earth is actually at its perihelion, which is the point when the earth is closest to the sun. So even when things are at their darkest, God is, quote, not far, though we may have to, quote, grope for him. Acts 17:27. There's a this is another quote from EMJ on Gemma Doherty's podcast. There's a transition that we have to make here. We have to become somehow philosophical. This is a more complicated world, and we have to come up with a way. I'm talking with people all over the world, and the one institution that can do it is the Catholic Church. We have the technology, we have the lingua franca, which is English now, but we need the philosophical basis. We need the basic categories. I'm sitting here with Americans. You're trying to talk to someone who has been baptized a Catholic, and they bring to the conversation one cliche after another. We have to break down these cliches. They're not helping you. They're distorting your world. Rise up. Have this transcendental view, because beauty is a transcendental. Unquote. I would like to invite you, Dr. Jones, and you, the Culture Wars reader, and you, the CAM podcast listener, to attend a pre-Advent online retreat with me this year to learn about, contemplate, and wrestle with Jesus' teachings of nonviolent love of friends and enemies during the month of November. In their own time, participants will listen to Behold the Lamb, a series of 16 recordings of talks that were given by Father Emmanuel Charles McCarthy at the Knox Shrine in Ireland, and we will convene every Tuesday night in the month of November for some prayer and discussion, 5 p.m. Pacific and 8 p.m. Eastern. Behold the Lamb is the best and perhaps the only resource that can give us the philosophical basis for gospel nonviolence, and the basic categories to think and talk about it. It will help us break down cliches about war and violence and pacifism and achieve a transcendental view of our world. It did this for Father George Zabelka, who was the Catholic chaplain to the Hiroshima-Nagasaki bomb crews. He said, Father McCarthy's retreat was the turning point in my conversion to Christian nonviolence. Father McCarthy's retreat was the turning point in my conversion to Christian nonviolence. And this podcast will be published on August 9th, which is the anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bomb on Nagasaki. Father Zabelka understood that the education of the conscience is a lifelong task. Catechism 1784. I would be especially excited if Dr. Jones would join the retreat, because the other problem I have with him, besides the fact that he would rescue an innocent grandmother who was being mugged against the explicit teachings of Jesus, I'm kidding, is that he spends most of his time online talking with intellectual pygmies like me. Rarely do you ever see him interact with someone on his level. I think Father McCarthy is on his level, and in the interest of iron sharpening iron, I would love to hear Dr. Jones's responses to Father McCarthy's lectures. Moreover, it seems to me that there is a curious connection or crossover between Dr. Jones' life's work and Father McCarthy's, and René Girard's. Now, this is something I can't quite put my finger on, but I know it would be fascinating to explore with other people. Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, Edith Stein, represents something of a lodestar here. She was a Jew born on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. She became a Carmelite nun and said she wanted to give her life in atonement for her people. She died at Auschwitz. The healing of Father McCarthy's daughter Benedicta, who was named after her, was the official miracle for her canonization. Final quote from E. Michael Jones. Understand what's perfect. Understand the basis that we have and break away all these cliches. It's gotta happen. That's good. It will open you up to a new vista. This is the world that's going to come into being after the American Empire goes down the drain. And it's going down the drain. And it's going down the drain because of the wretched excess and war and everything else. Something new and better is going to emerge. Unquote. I would just say to Dr. E. Michael Jones, nothing new, nothing better will emerge without Jesus. Jesus, in Revelations 21:5, behold, I make all things new. Jesus said, I have come to reveal things lain hidden since the foundation of the world. If you're listening to this, check out the links in the description. Join the pre-Advent retreat in November. My hope is that some parents will join the retreat for the adult retreat and then maybe sign their kids up for my Hunger Games class that will start in January. I teach the Hunger Games alongside Father McCarthy's Behold the Lamb material in order to teach kids about gospel nonviolence. And I think it'd be really good if the parents understood it first before the kids enrolled in the course, so they can also help me to clarify things for the kids when they come up and address the sticky questions. So 2 events coming up. I hope that you will join me. Thanks for being a listener of the CAM podcast, and I look forward to another great 100 episodes. God bless.